key slid into the lock with a groan that sounded less like iron and more like a throat clearing after too many years of silence. The door did not simply open, it reluctantly yielded, as though the house itself was taking a first breath after its long burial. The hinges moaned, not with rust but with something closer to pain, and the air that rushed forth carried the sour mineral tang of forgotten basements, graves, and stillborn memories. Dust rose in a slow, deliberate curl, stirred by the trespass. Of light. It drifted like ash shaken loose from the rafters of some long-extinguished fire. The man, whose name did not belong here, whose very presence sat uneasily against the bones of this place, stood in the doorway and felt the dust cling to his skin like cold fingers. It clung to his lashes until he blinked and saw motes dance like pale, half-formed faces. The hall stretched before him, narrow and suffocating, lined with faded wallpaper that peeled downward in strips like sagging flesh. Time had gnawed at everything. The banister drooped, the floorboards swelled, the ceilings bowed with the burden of secrets stored too long. But it was not simply age that haunted the farmhouse. The silence was too complete, as if all sound had been drawn out of the walls and trapped somewhere beneath. Best to open a window, he whispered to himself, though his voice felt unwelcome. Here, a foreign noise trespassing in a church of rot. The words did not echo. They fell like stones into a deep, unresponsive well. He stepped across the threshold, boots pressing into the wooden planks with a groan. Every board seemed to recognize the weight, to shift uneasily as though the house remembered. He carried the keys still in his palm, an old brass ring of 7, each one carved with notches too delicate, too deliberate for simple locks. They jingled faintly with his movement, but beneath the sound there came another, the faintest answering. Rattle somewhere deeper inside. The dust swirled upward, disturbed by his breath. It caught in the light that filtered through the cracked windows, and for a moment the air was thick with shimmering patterns, curling, knotting, like a scripture, written by unseen hands. He coughed once, breaking the spell, but the taste remained, dry, bitter, iron-heavy. On the mantel above a blackened hearth lay objects left behind, a rusted lantern, a ceramic doll with one cracked eye, and a small silver crucifix with its chain, snapped in half. These things waited like offerings upon an altar, each one coated in the same grey film of neglect. He brushed his fingers across the crucifix, and for an instant the dust clung too thickly, too eagerly, smearing like fresh soot. From upstairs came the sound of shifting wood, not the wind, not the settling of beams. A deliberate creak, as if something heavy had moved one step closer. His hand tightened on the keys. "Hello?" The word left him before he could catch it, fragile and stupid, drifting upward into that cavernous silence. The answer was nothing but another slow drift of dust falling from the ceiling, as though disturbed by a presence he could not see. He turned in a slow circle. The house seemed smaller now, pressing in around him, the walls breathing with faint draughts that whispered through the cracks. Each whisper carried the scent of mold, candle wax long since burned away, and something sweeter beneath, something cloying like spoiled fruit. He set his bag on the warped floorboards. The keys jingled again, though softer now, almost muted, as though the house had learned the rhythm of their sound and was beginning to echo it. He swore the ring weighed more in his hand than it had outside. On the far wall, near the entry to the parlor, hung a narrow mirror, its surface dulled to a smoky haze. He moved closer, wiping at the glass with his sleeve. The dust smeared, leaving behind streaks that formed shapes, circles, lines, scratches, until he realized the markings were not random. Someone had traced symbols into the dust long before him, symbols that still glowed faintly where the grime had been disturbed, like wounds that refused to heal. And in that moment, though his reflection wavered faint and pale behind the markings, he noticed something wrong. The mirror showed him standing in the doorway still, not in front of the glass where he truly was. The boards above groaned again. This time, 2 steps. Closer. His breath caught. He turned his face upward toward the staircase that coiled into darkness. The railing curved like a spine, vertebrae bending inward as though to protect whatever nested above. The shadows at the top did not recede, Even when a shaft of late afternoon light tried to pierce them, the farmhouse seemed to hold its breath again. Dust spiraled lazily through the dim air, pausing mid-flight, as though the very atmosphere was waiting. He took a single step toward the stairs. The keys in his palm grew warm, then hot, until the metal seared his skin. He dropped them with a cry. The sound of their fall was wrong. Too many keys, too many notes, like iron striking not wood but bone. And from the shadowed landing above came the faint sound of another set of keys, falling in perfect answer, ringing hollow in the silence. The dust curled downward this time, a grey curtain drifting slowly from the ceiling beams, obscuring the staircase. Within that veil, shapes moved, tall, uneven, swaying like figures bound at the neck. Their presence was not solid, but neither was it imagined. The farmhouse groaned once more, and then, with a long exhale, the upstairs door slammed shut. The hatch gave way with a sound like teeth snapping, and the breath that rose from beneath was not air but something heavier, something that clung. The stench of iron and rot rolled upward in a slow, suffocating tide, curling around his throat, worming its way into his lungs until his chest ached with the memory of graves. The lantern's flame guttered as he held it over the opening, its light shivering as if unwilling to enter. The beam fell upon steps worn too smooth for wood left untouched, stone steps, slick with damp, descending into a throat of blackness. Dust swirled on the rim of the hatch, drawn downward as if the cellar itself were inhaling. He crouched at the edge, his hand lingering on the hatch door. The wood was scarred, not with axe or knife, but with countless scratches. Lines upon lines, layered until they seemed almost deliberate, forming patterns his eyes wanted to follow, but could not. His fingers traced one, and it was warmer than it should have been, as though something beneath still remembered the hand that carved it. "Best not linger," he whispered, but even his own voice seemed reluctant, shrinking back from the dark. The lantern shook in his hand as he stepped onto the first stone, then the second. The air grew colder with every descent, wrapping him in damp cloth, heavy and sour. By the third step the light had dimmed, strangled by shadows that pressed close like a gathering crowd. His boots scraped against stone, slick with something, more than water. At the bottom the cellar opened like a mouth. The ceiling hung low, forcing him to bow, and the walls curved in strange, uneven arcs. They were not brick, not wood, not the work of any mason. They looked carved, as if chiseled by patient hands into shapes too deliberate to be natural, yet too alien to be human. Circles within circles, spirals winding into themselves, slashes angled just so. He raised the lantern higher. The markings caught the light with an oily sheen, as though freshly cut, as though the stone bled. His stomach turned. The smell of rot was sharper here, metallic, animal. And then, just at the edge of the lantern's trembling halo, something shifted. A soft, dragging sound like cloth pulled across damp stone. He froze. "Hello?" The words slipped out unbidden, foolish, desperate. Only silence answered, followed by a faint drip, drip, as though water or blood was falling steadily into some hidden pool. He stepped deeper. The cellar floor dipped, uneven, scattered with broken crates and rotted sacks. What should have been potatoes or onions lay mummified, blackened husks crumbling into powder at his touch. Yet in the far corner, one sack bulged, swollen, straining as if something alive still writhed inside. The lantern flame jittered. The sack twitched. He stumbled back, striking the wall. The carvings pressed against his shoulder like raised veins, and for a moment he felt heat seep into his skin, branding shapes he dared not glance at. "Leave it," he muttered, voice shaking, though he could not tear his eyes away from the swollen sack. Its seams stretched, threads straining. For a moment, he thought he heard breath within it, labored, wet. But then the lantern pulled his attention elsewhere. The far wall, opposite the steps, shone with something pale. He moved closer, steps reluctant, drawn as if by a string knotted, tight around his ribs. The light revealed indentations along the wall, narrow and deep like alcoves. Within each sat bundles of rags. No, not rags. Bodies. Small, collapsed, their outlines softened with time. He could not tell if they were children or something smaller still, bundled and bound. Cloth stained dark, stiff with the iron stench that had saturated this place. His hand flew to his mouth, and that was when he noticed the heads. Each bundle bore a carved circle where a face should have been, a hollow etched deep into the wrappings, as though identity itself had been cut away. He staggered back, the lantern flaring, shadows leaping across the walls. The spirals, the slashes, the circles, every mark seemed to turn with him, seemed to breathe, seemed to lean closer. A voice came then, not loud, not even distinct, a whisper, lower than breath, curling from the farthest corner of the cellar. Still, waiting. His lantern faltered. The flame bowed, almost extinguished, before leaping back with sudden violence. In its surge of light, he saw the sack in the corner split open. Not with a tear, but with precision, as if cut from within. Something, pale and wet, uncoiled from the burlap. Not a hand, not an animal's paw. Something that twitched like root and bone. Something that flexed as though relearning movement. The markings along the walls glowed faintly now, pulsing in rhythm with that movement, as though the house itself had been waiting for this breath, this twitch, this awakening. The cellar exhaled and the lantern blew out. The well stood like a sentinel at the edge of the field, a black mouth ringed in stone, waiting for someone foolish enough to lean close. The grass around it grew taller, thicker, darker than in the rest of the pasture, as if nourished by something other than rain. Even in daylight, shadows clung to the stones like bruises. He approached with a wariness he could not name. The farmhouse groaned in the distance, but here there was only the hush of wind, the brittle rustle of stalks, and the patient weight of the well watching him draw near. Its lip was cold beneath his palms, rough-hewn and pitted from years of rain and frost. Yet the stone felt damp, slick with a moisture that did not belong to the sunlit world. The sky stretched clear and pale above him. But when he leaned over, the well's mouth. No light shone back, no reflection of clouds, no glint of sun. Only darkness, as though the well swallowed not just water, but the sky itself. He lowered his head further, squinting. The dark seemed to stir, shifting faintly, not like rippling water, but like something moving just beyond reach. His pulse quickened, and with it came a sound, faint, curling up from the depths like smoke. At first he thought it wind-sliding against stone. Then with dreadful clarity he heard it, his own name breathed in a voice that was his, yet not his. The syllables dragged, elongated, as though spoken through water. "James." He jerked back, heart stuttering, lantern swaying at his side. The voice ceased instantly, as if it had only been waiting for his ear to come near. The field remained still, the sky above remained clear, but the silence that followed was not empty, it was poised, listening. He turned in a slow circle. The field stretched outward, wheat brittle and yellow, swaying faintly though no wind stirred. At the edges the stalks bent unnaturally inward, as if bowing toward the well. His mouth went dry. He forced a laugh, thin and unsteady. "Just the air," he muttered, "just the damned air through stone." But even as he said it, his words felt stolen, borrowed, already claimed by the black throat beneath him. He tried to step away. The keys in his pocket rattled, and from the well came the faintest answering jingle, echoing down in mimicry. He froze, the metal on his hip stilled, yet the sound continued, faint and deliberate, rising from the unseen water below. Against all reason, he found himself leaning forward again, breath catching. He peered deeper. His reflection should have been there by now, faint at least, rippling in the shadow. But there was nothing, only the same void, darker now, vast and swallowing. A shiver coursed through him. He reached for a pebble from the ground and tossed it in. He waited. No splash, no sound of stones striking water, only silence, thick, endless, as if the well had devoured not just the pebble, but the very noise of its fall. And then, soft, deliberate, a whisper unfurled upward once more, still waiting. The words were the same he had heard in the root cellar, the same cadence, the same breathless hunger. His lantern flickered violently. The flame bent toward the well, as if pulled by some unseen breath. His hand tightened around the handle, but the pull was real. The lantern trembled, dragged closer until he had to wrench it back. "Who's there?" His voice cracked. "Show yourself." But only the well answered, its black depths stirring. With faint, shimmering movement, the surface shifted, finally a reflection. But not his. The face that gazed up was gaunt, pale, its eyes hollow sockets rimmed in red. Its mouth moved in time with his breath, whispering his name again and again. James. 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 He staggered back, but his boots sank into the earth. The soil beneath him was damp, slick, sucking at his heels as though the ground itself wanted to keep him tethered. His lantern's flame flared once more, illuminating the stones. He saw now that the well's rim was not simply weathered. Each block bore shallow carvings, worn but unmistakable, circles, spirals, slashes, the same as those etched into the cellar walls. The whisper grew louder, layered, not one voice but many, each speaking his name with a slightly different intonation. Men, women, children, until it was a chorus of hollow mouths rising from the dark. The wheat bent lower as if listening. The air thickened, heavy with moisture, as though the well exhaled with every name spoken. And then, clear among the whispers, another voice. Look closer. He could not move. His body betrayed him. He leaned forward once more, lantern trembling over the abyss. The reflection shifted again. Not one face now, but dozens. Eyes wide, mouths open in silent screams, pressed against a surface that looked less like water and more like glass. They clawed, desperate, fingers streaking across the barrier. His lantern slipped, tumbling from his hand. He reached, but too late. The flame spun, a comet falling, shrinking into the black. There was no splash, no sound, only darkness swallowing, light hole. The voices hushed. The field fell silent, and then from the black throat of the well rose a hand. Pale, dripping, slick with something thicker than water, it gripped the rim of stone. The cellar exhaled, and the lantern blew out. The plough struck earth and screamed, not the metallic shriek of blade against stone, but a raw human cry, brief, guttural, swallowed by the fields before it could finish. His hands trembled on the handle, the horse shuddered, and the furrow he expected to open lay unbroken, the soil refusing to yield. The ground here was different. He had noticed it days before. Islands of earth scattered across the pasture, stubborn, unbroken patches where grass grew sickly and seeds rotted instead of sprouting. The villagers had whispered, muttering excuses of blight, poor drainage, cursed luck. But he had seen how, in moonlight, the patches did not lie still. They moved faintly, like the rise and fall of something breathing beneath. He crouched now, touching the soil with his bare hand. It was colder than the surrounding earth, damp though there had been no rain. The texture was wrong, too fine, too silken, as though sifted and sifted again. His fingertips came away darkened, stained not, brown but black as though dipped in soot. The horse snorted, jerking against its reins, hooves pawing at the ground. Its eyes rolled, whites gleaming in the afternoon light. "Easy, boy," he whispered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. He dug his fingers deeper. The soil shifted, resisting, pushing upward against his palm. Not like dirt displaced, but like flesh recoiling. He snatched his hand back and stared as the earth slowly settled, the faint impression of his handprint lingering too long, filling in as though swallowed. By nightfall he returned with only a lantern, drawn by unease more than reason. The field lay bathed in pale moonlight, silver brushing every stalk of wheat, every bent blade of grass. But the patches stood apart, glowing faintly as though lit from beneath, pulsing in rhythm, slow, steady, like the beat of a buried heart. He circled the nearest one, lantern held high. Shadows stretched and twisted, elongating unnaturally across the soil. Each time he moved, the shadow of his body seemed to linger a fraction longer than it should have, as if something beneath the ground wanted to keep hold of it. He spoke aloud, his voice hushed. "Why won't you grow?" The answer came not in words but in sound, faint, muffled, like a chorus buried deep. Not voices he could distinguish, but the rise and fall of tone, as though hundreds of throats sang through layers of dirt. The vibration reached his boots, crawling up his legs until his bones hummed. He staggered back, heart hammering. The lantern flickered, its flame bowing toward the patch of soil, pulled by some breath that exhaled upward. He dropped to his knees, compelled, and began clawing at the dirt. His nails split against the stubborn surface, black earth grinding into his skin, the cold biting deeper with every scrape. At last, the soil gave way in clumps, damp and heavy, and the stench of iron rolled forth like breath from a crypt. Beneath. The first few inches lay not root or stone, but fragments of cloth, rotted, clinging, woven through with hair that had long since turned brittle and grey. He recoiled, bile rising in his throat, but his hand brushed something solid beneath. He dug again, and uncovered bone. A jaw, broken and twisted, its teeth gritted with soil. The lantern's light shimmered across the hollow sockets of its skull. And yet, it was wrong. The bone was not dry, not brittle. It gleamed wet as though freshly unearthed, as though it had only just been buried. The earth shifted around it. The soil pulsed, the entire patch rising faintly, straining outward as if resisting the weight of its own dead. From the darkness beneath, something pushed back. He scrambled to his feet, nearly dropping the lantern. The soil swelled, rising, cracking, the surface splitting as though something within sought to climb free. For an instant, pale fingers broke through, thin, skeletal, wet. They twitched, clawing upward before the soil folded over them again, sucking them back down. The chanting swelled louder, a chorus of muffled cries vibrating the field. Every patch now pulsed in unison, glowing faintly beneath the moonlight. The horse, still tethered at the edge of the pasture, screamed, rearing against its reins until leather snapped. It fled into the night, its hooves pounding like war drums. He stood alone, lantern shaking, the ground alive around him. The soil at his feet shuddered once more. A hairline crack opened, spilling not earth, but liquid black, thicker than water, gleaming like oil. It spread outward, curling across the furrows, seeping into the wheat. Wherever it touched, the stalks blackened, shriveling into brittle husks. And then, beneath the chorus, a voice rose clearer than the rest. A voice he knew. James. He staggered backward, lantern raised high. The soil he had dug parted again, and from within the skull he had unearthed, the jaw creaked open. Soil spilled from its mouth, and in that stream of dirt, faint as a breath, came words whispered in his own voice. "Why did you wake us?" The ground convulsed. Every patch swelled at once, swelling, splitting, until the field heaved like a sea in storm. He turned to run, and saw the farmhouse in the distance, its windows aglow, not with lamplight, but with the same faint pulsing rhythm as the soil. The parlour was colder than the rest of the house, though no window stood open, no draught crept through the boards. It was the kind of cold that lingered in churches after funerals, an emptiness that clung to the ribs and hollowed the breath. He stepped inside, lantern raised, its glow catching on gilt frames that lined the walls. Portraits hung in rows, floor to ceiling, their varnish dulled by decades of neglect. Dust veiled them, yet even beneath the grime their presence was unmistakable. Family, generation after generation, posed in their Sunday best, gazing out across the years, but none had eyes. At first he thought time had stolen them, that the paint had simply flaked away. But the longer he stared, the more he saw. The brushstrokes remained, the shadows of faces were intact, yet where eyes should have been, there was only blur, a smear, a deliberate unmaking. Some sockets looked smudged, as if wiped away by a careless hand. Others seemed torn, gouged, hollowed. He drew closer to the largest frame above the mantel. A woman sat stiffly in her chair, dressed in black, a lace collar tight around her throat. Her hands lay folded in her lap, one ring gleaming faintly through the dust. But where her gaze should have been, two voids stared back, dark stains, glossy, too fresh. His lantern flame wavered. He could swear the sockets gleamed wetly, as if tears had been wept only moments before. The silence pressed close. Then faintly, from somewhere deep in the house, a board creaked as if answering the discovery. He reached out, hand trembling, brushing dust from the canvas. The surface was damp, his fingertips coming away slick, smeared with something darker than dust. He held them to the light, red-brown, staining. His stomach knotted. He whispered, barely audible, "Paint doesn't bleed." The words seemed to stir the parlor itself. The candle stub on the mantel flickered to life with no hand to light it, its flame bowing toward the portraits. One by one, the sockets of the painted faces caught the glow and glistened, as though, wet as though watching. He staggered back, lantern trembling. The faces had shifted subtly. The smudges were deeper now, the sockets wider, their hollows turned not toward the room at large, but toward him. He tried to avert his gaze, but each frame drew him in, demanding notice. Children with eyeless stares, men in waistcoats with hollow sockets that reflected nothing. A boy clutching a toy horse, his mouth smiling faintly, yet the sockets of his face yawning, black as graves. The whisper came then, not from the walls, not from upstairs, from the frames themselves, a chorus layered, mouths painted, still yet somehow moving within the silence. "You should not have stayed." He spun, lantern jerking. The light swept across the parlor, and for a heartbeat the faces were whole, eyes, returned, wide, glinting, alive. They blinked, and then as quickly were empty once more. His knees weakened. His breath rattled loud in the crushing stillness. He turned toward the door and froze. Another portrait hung there now, where there had been none. The frame was crooked, the canvas still smelling of oil, and within it, himself, his own likeness. Stared back, lantern in hand, jaw tight with fear. But the eyes smudged away, hollowed, wet with a glisten of fresh red. "No," his voice cracked. "No, that's not—" The lantern sputtered. Shadows bloomed thick across the walls. The portraits leaned closer in the flickering dark, their hollow gazes multiplying, swallowing the room. He stumbled back, colliding with the mantel. The crucifix he had seen days earlier lay there still, chain broken. Desperate, he snatched it up, thrusting it toward the canvas of himself. The metal seared his palm, scalding hot, but he did not release it. The painted figures, mouth stretched into a silent scream. The candle on the mantel guttered out, and in the black that followed, he felt breath on the back of his neck, warm, damp, drawn too close. He turned. The largest portrait, the woman in black, no longer sat in her painted chair. Her frame hung empty, canvas yawning blank, the lace collar gone, but he could hear the soft drag of her skirts moving across the floor behind him. The barn doors sagged on their hinges, heavy with rust, yet they yielded as though something within had been waiting for his hand. A cold wind rushed out, not the kind born of weather, but of breath, a stale exhalation that reeked of mildew and iron. He lifted the lantern. Its glow spilled across the barn's cavernous interior, illuminating rafters draped in cobweb, bales rotted into mulch, and the long shapes of tools abandoned mid-use. The air was thick with dust, yet beneath it lingered another scent, sweet, cloying, spoiled like fruit left to blacken in the sun. Along the far wall, stacked neatly despite the ruin around them, lay the sacks, dozens, perhaps more. Burlap faded to yellow, stitched seams sagging with the weight of grain sealed inside. And though 84 years had passed, the sacks appeared, untouched by moth or rot, as though guarded from decay by something more deliberate than chance. He approached slowly. His boots scuffed the straw-strewn floor, the sound too loud in the silence, each step followed by a faint rustle that was not his own. The horse that had once accompanied him here had long fled, yet he felt the same unease. It had carried the sense that the barn was aware of his intrusion. He crouched before the nearest sack, lantern swaying, shadows crawling up the walls. The burlap was cool, damp to the touch. He pressed his palm against its side. The sack shifted, not sagged, shifted, as if something within had stirred at the weight of his hand. His breath caught. He leaned closer, listening. A faint, dry rustle came from within, like grains tumbling, but too steady, too rhythmic, like the faint brush of insect legs against cloth. He found a rusted knife on a nearby beam. With trembling fingers, he pressed it to the seam and cut. The sack groaned open, the burlap splitting like old skin. What spilled forth was not grain, not entirely. The kernels were pale, waxy, glistening faintly in the lantern's light. They shifted, rolled, and then moved of their own accord. Tiny, shapes curled within them, half-formed, writhing sluggishly as though waking from long sleep. Some split open to reveal hair-thin tendrils, questing blindly through the air, reaching for the warmth of his skin. He stumbled back with a cry. The lantern swung wildly, light dancing across the walls. The spilled kernels pulsed in unison, twitching, dragging themselves closer together, as if trying to reform the sack's shape. "God help me," he whispered. The whisper was answered, not by God, but by the barn itself. A faint chorus rose from the remaining sacks, rustling, shifting, thousands of small bodies stirring in unison. The sound grew louder, layered, until it resembled not rustling, but a hiss. He backed toward the doors. His lantern shook violently in his grip. Then, against reason, his gaze caught on the second sack, its seam already frayed, a sliver of its contents exposed. Inside, the kernels writhed, but not blindly. They pressed against the gap, straining outward. And between them he saw it, a fragment of bone, pale and small, the edge of a jaw. The kernels clung to it, fused to it, pulsing in rhythm like organs feeding a body not yet whole. His throat closed. The knife slipped from his hand, clattering against the boards. The sound made the hissing cease, abruptly, chillingly, until only silence remained. Then, all at once, the sacks erupted. Burlap split in ragged tears, spilling their contents across the barn floor. Waves of writhing kernels poured outward, flowing like a living tide. They moved together, drawn not by gravity but by hunger, converging in thick streams that pulsed toward him. He turned, throwing his weight against the doors. They shuddered but did not open, swollen in their frames, as though the barn itself had decided to keep him. The tide reached his boots. The kernels climbed, dozens, hundreds, latching onto leather, onto cloth, wriggling upward with blind persistence. He swatted them off, but more came, clinging to his skin with sticky tendrils that burned cold. Above, the rafters groaned. He looked up just as the lantern's light caught movement, sacks strung high, swaying, splitting. Their seams burst, and grain rained down in a black cascade, filling the air, choking his breath. Through the choking cloud, he heard them. Not the hiss, not the rustle, but voices, thin, high, layered with grief and hunger, rising from the writhing grain. We were planted, we were fed, we were left. He choked on the words, on the stench of rot and iron. The tide surged higher, climbing, his legs wrapping his waist, pulling him down as though the barn floor had turned to quicksand. His lantern slipped from his grasp, crashing to the boards. Flame licked across the straw, smoke curling upward, but the grain did not burn. The fire hissed, smothered, strangled out by the living tide. And in the lantern's dying glow, he saw shapes forming within the swell, limbs coalescing, faces half-carved, eyes not yet open. The harvest was gathering itself, taking form. A hand, wet and glistening with kernels clinging to its flesh, broke free from the tide. It reached for him. The first night he heard her, the wind was still, yet the air trembled as though carrying a hymn meant for no living ear. It rose from the fields, not like the lowing of cattle or the rustle of corn, but like a woman's voice, long, mournful, notes stretched thin with grief, threading through the soil and into the marrow of the bones. He froze on the porch, lantern dimmed, eyes straining toward the darkness that pressed against the farmhouse. The sound wavered, carrying as if from every direction, until he could not tell whether it came from the trees, the distant marsh, or from directly beneath his feet. The townsfolk had spoken of her. The widow. A voice left behind when flesh was swallowed by the ground. Some said she had been a farmer's bride, waiting for a husband who never returned from the war. Others swore she had lost her children in the fever that swept Charleston, and laid herself in the furrows beside them. But all the stories agreed. She lingered, she sang, and those who lingered long beneath her song lost something that could never be reclaimed. He whispered into the wind, testing the silence. "Who's there?" The singing faltered. For one heartbeat it broke, as though surprised to be heard. Then it resumed, stronger, low and droning, as though the earth itself had taken a breath. Drawn as though by a thread, he stepped from the porch. Grass brushed his boots, cool with dew, though the air was parched. The lantern's glow stuttered. With each stride, its flame shrinking against the pull of the song. Beyond the fence the field spread wide, a sea of blackened stalks swaying without wind. Somewhere among them, a figure moved, slight, veiled in shadow. She swayed as she sang. A silhouette bent beneath grief. "Who are you?" he called again, though his voice cracked, breaking softer than he intended. The song did not answer, but the shape lifted its head. Two pale hollows glimmered where eyes should have been. He faltered, the lantern guttered, and though the figure was still, the stalks around him swayed violently, as if stirred by her lament. The sound pressed closer, wrapping around his skull, filling his lungs until he felt he breathed her grief instead of air. "Do not linger," a memory whispered. Words. Of the innkeeper who had first spoken of her. "Do not stay until the song takes hold. Shadows are all we are allowed. She leaves nothing of them behind." Yet his legs moved without his command, carrying him deeper into the field. His lantern's glow flickered across broken furrows, across patches of soil that seemed to pulse faintly, as if still alive. The song thickened so close now that it was not sound at all but vibration, trembling through the marrow of his teeth. At last, he stood before her. The widow was no taller than his shoulder, draped in what might once have been a dress, now tatters clinging, like cobweb. Her head tilted as her mouth opened wider, wider still, and the song burst from her like a wound. Her lips did not move with words, but parted as though spilling a wind that was older than the earth. He raised the lantern to her face. Her eyes were not hollows, but glistening sockets, brimming with stagnant water. Within them floated shadows, faint outlines of human forms, limbs thrashing, mouths open in silent cries, faces without bodies, bodies without weight. His hand shook. The lantern's glass chimed. "Why do you sing?" His voice was barely more than air. She leaned closer. Her mouth split in a grin that was not joy, but the tearing of grief so deep it had rotted into madness. Her voice fell to a whisper, jagged and broken. "Because they listen." She gestured with one long, crooked finger. He turned. Behind him the field was no longer empty. Figures stood among the stalks, tall, short, broad, thin. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, but none cast a shadow. The lantern's glow slid through them as if through smoke. Their eyes were wet voids, brimming with the same black water that drowned the widow's own, and though their mouths did not move, their song joined hers, a low drone swelling until the air trembled. His lantern slipped. It struck the soil with a muffled thud, light dying in an instant. Darkness rushed in, swallowing the field whole, and in that darkness he felt his own shadow peel away. It tore from his heels like skin, sliding forward, dragged into the chorus of those already claimed. He staggered, tried to grasp it, but his hands closed on nothing. His body was lighter, hollower, a shell from which something essential had been pulled. The widow's lament rose to a scream, triumphant. The field was full of shadows now, dancing without bodies. His own was among them, and in the shimmer of their movements he saw what was coming. A figure larger than them all, rising from the horizon, stitched together from their absence, blotting out the moon. The sound began as a shiver in the soil, a faint metallic tremor that climbed through his boots and into his bones. Then came the rattle, iron against iron, muffled by earth and ivy, yet deliberate, as though a hand beneath the soil struck again, and again demanding release. He had walked the farmhouse grounds a dozen times, yet tonight the lantern's glow caught on something he had overlooked, a square of iron, half buried beneath creeping ivy at the base of a hillock. Rust gnawed at its hinges, its seams thick with roots, but its shape was undeniable. A door. Not to any room above, but to the earth itself. The ivy shifted as if recoiling from his touch when he reached down, tearing vines away. Damp soil clung beneath his nails, and with each handful he unearthed more of the corroded frame. The door was low, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. Its handle, thick with rust, pulsed faintly with the vibrations that rose from below. The rattling ceased the moment his hand touched it. Silence pooled thick and sudden, so absolute that even the insects hushed. He whispered to no one, though the words felt stolen from his breath. "Who's down there?" The soil answered with a hollow knock. 3 times, measured, patient. He stumbled back, lantern shuddering in his grasp. The air smelled of rot and cold iron, yet beneath it lingered another scent, faint, cloying, almost sweet, like flowers cut and left too long in stagnant water. The lantern's flame wavered. Shadows clung to the ivy, stretching long, bending. Not with the wind, but with something deeper, older. He returned at dawn when courage hid behind sunlight, but the door was still. The ivy draped itself once more as though to conceal its existence. By nightfall it rattled again. The sound spread through the house this time, shaking floorboards, quivering glass, humming in the walls. It was no longer confined to the hillock. The very earth seemed restless. He pressed his ear to the floor. From beneath came whispers, layered and broken, as though 1,000 throats tried to speak through a mouthful of dirt. He could not make out words, but their rhythm was unmistakable, pleading, cajoling, promising. That night sleep betrayed him. Dreams dragged him down into soil, into narrow tunnels that reeked of iron and damp. Hands brushed against him in the dark, pale and root-thin, tugging, guiding. At the dream's end he stood before the door, but from the other side. The bolts gleamed new, and through their cracks spilled a blinding light. When he woke, his mouth was full of dirt. He told himself not to return. He told himself to lock the house, to burn the ivy, to forget. But the rattling grew louder, louder, until the windows quaked, louder until the barn swayed, louder until his teeth ached from the sound. By the 3rd night, he could no longer resist. Lantern in one hand, rusted crowbar in the other, he returned to the hillock. The door was trembling violently now, earth shifting around its edges as though something vast pressed against it. The ivy tore itself loose, writhing like snakes in retreat. He wedged the crowbar into the seam. Rust screamed. The hinges split with a shower of dirt. And with one last wrench the lock gave way. The door swung open, not upward but downward, like a trap's jaw. A rush of air surged out, cold, damp and fetid, laced with the unmistakable scent of open graves. The lantern's flame recoiled, nearly snuffing out, but steadied just enough to reveal the stair descending into blackness. Steps of stone, slick with moisture, spiraling down into a throat, cut deep into the earth. From below, the whispers swelled. They no longer begged. They laughed. He lowered the lantern, its glow spilling down into the spiral. The walls were carved with symbols, crude, jagged, etched not with chisels but with nails, as though countless hands had clawed their prayers into the stone. And there, halfway down the stair, was the first figure. It sat slumped against the wall, skin tight as parchment stretched over bone. Its jaw hung open, yet from it issued no breath, only the whispers. They rose from its hollow mouth in a tongue not spoken by the living. He staggered back, but the stair seemed to pull him downward, each step groaning underfoot as if it had waited for him alone. Below, more figures stirred, dozens, perhaps hundreds, their bodies pressed into alcoves cut in the walls like crude graves. Their eyes were pits, empty yet glistening with the faintest reflection of lantern flame, and though their limbs did not move, their mouths worked in unison, shaping words he could not understand. The air thickened. The whispers rose until they became a chant, low and rhythmic, echoing like a heartbeat in the stone. He turned to flee, but the stair above him was gone. The door had shut, sealing the earth once more, and from below, something vast began to climb the spiral. The first time he saw them, it was not their shapes that froze his blood, but their stillness. 4 figures, one at each corner of the land, standing in symmetry so precise, it felt like a ritual carved into the very night. The moon was low, veiled, in thin cloud, yet its pale light drew their forms clear against the dark. They were tall, gaunt, their outlines wavering like smoke. None stepped forward, none retreated. They only stood silent guardians of some invisible boundary, and yet their mouths were open, wide, unnaturally wide. He could see the pale gleam of teeth, the hollow dark of throats stretched as though in eternal scream, but no sound carried. He pressed his forehead to the glass of the farmhouse window, heart battering like a moth trapped in a jar. His lantern had burned low, and in its weak glow the shadows in the room seemed to reach toward the window, urging him not to look too long, not to let their gaze catch his own. Still, he looked. He could not stop. The figure nearest the barn tilted, its head slow as a tree bending in an unnatural wind. Its jaw widened, unhinging farther than bone should allow. The silence deepened, so dense it felt like wool stuffed into his ears. And then he heard it, not with his ears but behind his ribs, a murmur, a chant, rising and falling like the swell of a tide. Not his, not yet, not whole. He stumbled back from the window, knocking the lantern to the floor. Its light guttered out, plunging the farmhouse into black. Darkness did not bring safety. It brought clarity. Through the window panes, faint light gathered around the figures, an unholy glow that seeped from their gaping mouths, casting the corners of the property in sickly pallor. The fields shimmered with the glow, and he saw lines etched into the earth, circles within circles, connected by furrows like veins. The figures stood upon them perfectly, as if rooted in place. A ritual was already drawn. He was standing in its heart. "Leave me," he whispered, though to whom he prayed he could not say. The chant grew louder in his chest. He clutched his shirt, feeling his own heart falter to its rhythm, as though the beat belonged no longer to him. The figures raised their arms in unison. The motion was slow, deliberate, as though pulled by strings from some hand that moved beyond the stars. Their shadows stretched across the soil, meeting at the center where the farmhouse stood. The ground trembled, the walls groaned, the windows hummed like struck glass. He staggered outside, unable to resist the pull of it, the cold night air pressing like a shroud against his skin. His breath smoked in the moonlight, though the air was not cold enough for frost. At the farthest corner, one of the figures turned its head toward him. Its jaw quivered, stretched wide as though straining against some unseen gag. And in that instant the silence broke. A shriek erupted, not through the air, but through the earth itself. The ground beneath him screamed, a raw, tearing sound as though soil and stone were being ripped apart. He fell to his knees, hands clamped over his ears, though it made no difference. The sound crawled through his skull, scraping bone, boiling marrow. His teeth ached as if trying to split from his jaw. When the shriek ceased, he dared to lift his eyes. The figures had not moved, but the earth had. At the center of the property, directly before the farmhouse, a fissure had split open. It was not wide, yet its depth was endless, swallowing moonlight without return. From its edges, pale steam rose, curling like breath on a winter morning, and in the steam shapes writhed, faces pressed outward, fleeting and grotesque, their mouths also open in eternal chant. Arms stretched upward, not to climb, but to pull, not to escape, but to summon. The figures at the corners tilted their heads back. Their jaws gaped wider still, until they were nothing but hollow chasms where sound should dwell. From within the fissure, something answered, a hand, long, with fingers too many, each joint bending the wrong way, gripped the edge of the split. Earth? Its nails gouged deep into the soil, anchoring. Another hand followed. The steam thickened, rising into a column that pulsed with light as though a heart beat within it. The chant swelled until the farmhouse shook like a drum, and through the veil of steam the rest began to rise. It began with the sound of splitting stone, a groan that shuddered through the beams of the farmhouse, like the house itself had found a voice. From the cellar came the noise, low and steady, as though the foundations of the earth had grown restless and sought to tear themselves free. He crept down the stairs, lantern clutched in a trembling hand, the flame guttering against the draught that rose from below. Each step bowed beneath his weight, the wood warped with damp. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of turned soil, wet. Metallic, cloying, as if the cellar had become less a room and more a grave newly dug. At the bottom, the sight met him. Walls that had once been stone now veined with cracks, their mortar spilling like sand. From between those fractures seeped soil, not falling but pushing, driven by a force beneath. It poured in slow, deliberate waves, piling against the floor until it seemed the cellar would choke with earth. He raised the lantern higher. The soil moved, not like a slide or collapse, but like a tide advancing. Each clump shifted against the next, rolling forward with a grim intent. From its surface, pale roots curled upward like fingers, questing in the lantern's light. He stumbled back, his shoulders striking the stairs, and then the first shape rose. It was not bone, not relics of the dead, long buried and long forgotten. What the earth birthed was stranger. The soil heaved, swelled, and from it tore a form, shaped almost like a man, but wrong. Its limbs were long, bending in places where no joint should exist, its skin a pale sheath clotted with dirt. Its head tilted back, mouth opening wide, not in scream nor in song, but in a silence so deep the lantern's flame flickered as though starved of air. Another followed, then another. The cellar filled with them, rising one by one from the pressing tide of soil. Their forms birthed from the cracks in the walls, as if the house had been holding them back for decades, and the house could hold no more. He pressed himself against the stairs, breath ragged, throat burning with the sour taste of earth. "Go back," he whispered, though his voice was thin, a child's plea before an ocean. The figures tilted their heads in unison. Soil sloughed from their bodies, thudding against the stone floor. Their sockets were hollow, yet within them a faint glimmer pulsed red and wet, as though eyes had not yet fully formed. One stepped forward, its foot pressed into the floorboards, and the wood blackened beneath it, rotting in an instant. The scent of decay rolled upward, filling the cellar with the stench of centuries undone. He turned, stumbling for the stairs. His lantern shook, throwing broken light across the walls. The cracks widened as if mocking his flight, and more shapes poured through, arms clawing free, torsos wrenching from the soil, mouths opening wider, wider, until their jaws split the flesh of their faces. A chorus rose from them, not sound but vibration, rattling his ribs, shaking dust from the beams above. It was not a hymn, it was not language, it was recognition. They had been waiting. He reached the stairs' midpoint when the house itself groaned, louder than thunder, louder than the sea. The boards split beneath his feet. Soil burst upward, swallowing steps whole. A hand wet with loam seized his ankle, cold and firm, pulling him down. He kicked, lantern swinging wild, spilling oil across the railing. Flame bloomed. For one heartbeat, the cellar lit bright as day. And he saw them all. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, their forms pressed into the walls, half-born, half-buried, faces straining from the stone, as though the house had swallowed them alive. Their mouths gaped in the same silent recognition, the same hunger. The flame gleamed in their eyes like coins in a pit. The fire caught. Straw blackened, oil hissed. Smoke poured upward, choking the stair. But the things did not recoil. They welcomed it. Their hollow mouths opened wider still, drinking the smoke, swallowing the fire, as though flame itself was what the earth had denied them all these years. He tore free, stumbling into the kitchen above. Behind him the cellar roared, not with fire, not with collapse, but with voices that had never been given leave to speak. The floor buckled. Cracks split across the boards, soil spilling upward like blood through cloth. The house shuddered as though trying to take flight, yet chained by what clawed within. He fell to his knees as the lantern guttered its last. And in the dark, from the split earth of the cellar below, something vast rose, not flesh, not bone, but the memory of them all bound together into a single towering shape, a shadow with no form yet heavier than stone. Its presence pressed against the house until walls wept dust and glass screamed in their panes. He dared one glance. It leaned close, a face forming from soil and shadow, its mouth wider than the cellar itself. And in that endless dark he saw his own reflection, waiting to be remembered.